I know everyone's attention is waning because it's Saturday afternoon and everyone is tired, but the saving grace of this talk is that you get to see cute clips of babies, so hopefully that will enliven everyone. So then it might not surprise you to learn that I'm a developmental psychologist, and today what I'm going to be talking about is what I think are some of the building blocks of moral character in very young children and kids in the first 2 years of life. Okay, so I want to start by looking a little bit historically, because I think one of the first questions for someone who's interested in looking at the development of moral character concerns, when are we going to start looking? When in development are we going to start looking? And so to answer this question, we need to know a little bit, all of us as a group, about moral development broadly construed, and also about the history of moral development. So I'm going to go through, kind of run roughshod over the last several decades, or more than several decades, of moral development to tell you what people have thought historically and how things have changed. So of course, many of you will know that questions about the development of morality are long-standing. They're of long-standing interest to not only psychologists, but developmental psychologists more specifically. And there are two key players in the field of moral development. Historically, there were two key players in the field. For Piaget and Kohlberg, some of the sort of kingpins of the early study of moral development, they saw moral development as following a protracted development, going through a series of stages, and changing due to changes in moral reasoning. So Kohlberg, for example, argued that children, when they're faced with moral dilemmas, will first come up with responses to these dilemmas with respect to considerations of rewards and punishment. And then a little bit later, children become concerned about societal rules or conventions, and that it's not until about adolescence that children are reasoning on the basis of truly moral principles. So of course, this viewpoint has consequences for testing the construct of moral character, because this viewpoint would say, look, it's not until late childhood that we can even really start asking these questions and trying to answer them. But now what I want to tell you is that subsequent research has revealed a relatively different picture. So with respect to children's moral developments, research by Elliott Turiel and colleagues has tested preschool-age children and found that they're very good at distinguishing between moral transgressions that we would see as more of a kind of social convention transgression or violation, and personal judgments. So preschool-age child can tell you, for example, that it's wrong to hit someone, and it's always wrong to hit someone, even if the teacher tells you that it's okay, regardless of what country that it's in. But something like raising your hand in class is a social convention, so that means that if you have permission, you can, from the teacher, you can decide not to raise your hand to ask a question. And that both of these domains are different from things that require personal judgments, like what shirt you're going to wear. So that's present by preschool age. And there's also some evidence to suggest that when we're talking about moral reasoning, at least in some cases, that it doesn't always require higher level thought or highly abstract symbolic or cognitive capabilities. So that's one reason to believe that maybe we can ask questions about character earlier in development. With respect to the flip side of the coin, with respect to moral behavior, we know from work by Nancy Eisenberg and her colleagues that engagement in prosocial behavior in early childhood predicts later altruism and other orientedness. So these findings suggest that maybe we can look earlier than was traditionally thought. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, I'm going to be searching for the building blocks of moral character in infancy. And you might say, well, why would you be motivated to look at infants? Well, first of all, we know from several decades of research now that infants actually possess relatively rich knowledge about their social world, and certainly much richer knowledge than we thought traditionally. So infants within the first 2 years of life can recognize mental states like goals and intentions and desires, and understand the role that they play in behavior. There's some nice recent evidence to suggest that infants make what we might call valenced evaluations. So they evaluate other people's behavior along positive, negative dimension, along a good-bad dimension, particularly other social behavior. We know that there are capacities that underpin moral behavior, like empathy. We heard a lot about empathy earlier this afternoon. And individual differences in these capacities can be traced back to infancy, stable individual differences. And finally, we now know from many, many different studies, some of which are conducted in naturalistic settings, going into the home, others that are conducted in the lab, where you bring a baby into the lab and you present them with little scenarios, that within the first 2 years of life, you see evidence of prosocial behavior, sharing, helping, and comforting, and that children at this age seem highly motivated to engage in these types of prosocial behavior. So this motivated us to ask in the studies that I'll be talking to you about today, whether infants, if there's evidence for infants engaging in moral judgments or evaluations. And the way that we looked at this in the study that I'll be telling you about today has to do with infants' detection of violations of what we might call socio-moral norms, whether infants notice those violations, and more than that, whether infants vary their behavior on the basis of the person they're interacting with, whether that person abides by or violates a particular socio-moral norm. And we were also interested in aspects of moral behavior, prosocial behavior in particular, but a very particular kind of prosocial behavior, and that is one that involves a personal cost. So infants' willingness to engage in prosocial behavior that involves a personal cost to themselves. Now, of course, when you're asking questions like this, when you want to know about infants' acquisition of socio-moral norms, you have to pick something specific to focus on. You can't sort of take it on all at once. And the socio-moral norm that we chose to focus on is something that researchers tend to call the principle of equality. So the idea here is that adults tend to have a belief that all things considered equal, not knowing much about characters involved in a scene, that when they have goods and resources, those goods and resources should be divided equally to social partners, to recipients. And evidence for the fact that adults possess this socio-moral norm comes from a variety of different work, some of which comes from economic games. So bringing adults into the lab, giving them resources, points, money, whatever, asking them to divide those resources between themselves and an anonymous social partner. So in these circumstances, adults will tend to divide resources equally. Somewhat surprising given that this person is A, anonymous, B, does not have the opportunity to reciprocate, and C, they're not going to meet this person after the fact. These studies have also revealed that in these contexts, adults will punish individuals when they violate this norm, and they sort of act like Robin Hood in the sense that they're redistributing goods accordingly. And finally, there's finding from fMRI studies that show that value-related neural structures are activated when an individual allocates goods equally, not just when someone is doing it themselves, but also when they're watching someone else allocate goods. And conversely, unequal allocations, either performed by the self, witnessed by other people, tend to engage regions of the brain that are associated with negative or aversive emotional states. And of course, we also know that there's individual and cross-cultural variability in terms of adherence and endorsement to this norm. And in the last several years, there's been evidence to suggest that in the preschool period, children seem to be aware of this norm and use their behavior and act according to this norm, and also to evaluate the actions of other people in terms of whether they follow this norm or not. So here were the main questions that we addressed over the past couple of years. So the first question that we asked was whether infants have a sense of fairness. And here I'm talking about a particular case of fairness. This is a situation where you don't know much about the people involved, and so the assumption is that people should, when you have goods to distribute, you should distribute them equally, and if you don't follow that norm, then you're violating fairness. And the related question that we asked here was whether, if infants do possess a sense of fairness, whether we might see a relationship between that sense and their prosocial behavior. And one of the reasons that we were motivated to ask this question was that there's been a long-standing debate in the literature about the relationship between moral judgments, evaluation, reasoning, and moral behavior. So some studies find a tight association, other studies find no association. And no one has really looked at this in early development, so we wanted to try to address that question. The next question that we wanted to ask, assuming that infants at some point do have a sense of fairness, is whether this sense of fairness undergoes developmental change. So you might think, well, why should we care about this, whether this is constant through development or whether it undergoes developmental change? Well, certainly in my field, there's a lot of debate about whether infants might possess innate socio-moral principles. And that perspective would predict that as early as you can test infants on the paradigms that we use, you'll see evidence of a sense of fairness. But of course, another viewpoint is that this sense is influenced, is fed by socialization practices. So if we see developmental change, we might think, well, maybe the account looks more like the latter than like the former. And if we see developmental change, what we wanted to know is, well, what might the source of this developmental change be? What might be driving developmental change here? And then finally, assuming that infants, like adults, are individually variable in their sense of fairness and in their prosocial behavior, we wanted to know whether this individual variability reflects true individual differences. So when infants perform differently than one another on our task, is it because they're really different from one another? Or does it just have to do with some sort of random fluctuation or noise in the data, right? For example, let's say one infant comes in well-fed and happy and another infant comes in not well-fed and cranky. That could look like individual differences, but actually not be real veridical individual differences. So I'm going to tell you about a number of studies that we've conducted over the past 2 years, 2 cross-sectional studies, 1 longitudinal study that tested infants ranging in age from 6 months to 24 months. And I'm going to sort of flip back and forth a little bit between the studies because I'm going to sort of organize our findings in terms of the conceptual point rather than the study. So with respect to the first question, do infants have a sense of fairness, and does this sense of fairness relate to their prosocial behavior? So I want to share the results of 2 studies with you. This first study we actually conducted just prior to getting the grant, but it sort of sets the groundwork for the subsequent studies, so I want to share that study with you. This was the study with 15-month-old infants, and we tested them on 2 tasks, one that was designed to get at their sense of fairness, another that was designed to get at their prosocial behavior, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the specifics of those tasks in just a moment. And then in a separate study, we tested another group of infants, and again here we were interested in infant sense of fairness, but we wanted to use a different dependent measure to get at this sense. And our motivation for doing this is to say, as I think Angela said on Friday, she put this very kind of succinctly and nicely, as a psychologist, we know that any particular task sucks, and they all suck in their own way. And so we're trying to kind of get around that here by using convergent methods to get at the same underlying construct. So one would feel more confident if these kind of findings converge. If they diverge, then we might start to think there's something odd about our tasks. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about how we measured infant sense of fairness. And I want to, before I go to the sort of specifics of the slide, I want to back up a little bit and tell you about the underlying logic of the violation of expectancy paradigm that we used, which is a really commonly used method with infants that relies on infants' visual behavior, in particular how long they look at expected and unexpected outcomes. The idea behind these paradigms is that you can set up a story for infants and then you show them 2 outcomes. You record how long they look at those outcomes. If they think that something is unusual or unexpected, they should show enhanced attention. They should look longer at the unexpected or unusual outcome. And this sort of principle of enhanced attention to things that are unusual or unexpected has been established over a series of decades. It's not only true of infants, it's also true of children and adults. And because young infants, of course, we don't have a ton of ways to kind of get at their knowledge, this is a really useful method because infants, of course, are very good at looking at things. So we created a violation of expectancy paradigm for our study to get at this question of fairness. And what infants did is they came into the lab, they sat on a caregiver's lap. The caregiver was instructed to look down at their infant so they wouldn't know what was on the screen, couldn't influence infants looking. And we started by, on a television monitor, showing infants a little story or a vignette. And what they see during the story is they see someone who has a bowl of crackers. They actually saw 2 movies, one where someone had a bowl of crackers, another one where someone had a pitcher of milk, but I'll tell you about the crackers video. They're structurally analogous. And the distributor just demonstrates to 2 recipients that she has a bowl of crackers. They simultaneously say please, and they scoot up their plates to her. And then what happens is that a black screen comes up on the monitor. So we digitally insert a black screen. And the purpose of this screen is to obscure what the distributor is doing exactly. So infants can see in the movie that the distributor is distributing goods to each plate, but what they don't know is how much they're distributing to who. So what we're trying to do here is elicit an expectation about how this story ends. And then after she's distributed the goods, she demonstrates that they're all gone. So what we're really interested in measuring here is infants' attention to outcomes to this story. And we show infants both experimental and control outcomes. And the experimental outcomes, what they see is they see an ending of the story where, in one case, the equal outcome, the recipients receive equal amounts of crackers, or if they're looking at milk movies, they get equal amounts of milk. In the unequal outcome, one recipient gets more than the other, more crackers or more milk. Now, the idea here is that if infants think that it's unusual that one of the 2, that the goods were distributed unequally and one person got more than the other, then they should look longer at the unequal outcome than at the equal outcome. But of course, there's alternate interpretations, one of which is that it could be the case if infants show our hypothesized pattern of findings that what's really going on is that they have a, say, preference for asymmetry in visual displays, right? So we need control conditions to rule that out. So in this study, the control condition that we ran was one in which infants just saw plates on crackers. The actual setup of the crackers was identical to the experimental condition, but there's no actors present. So by removing the social element, obviously there's no considerations of fairness, and we can look to see whether infants have any sort of baseline preferences for the outcomes of these displays. Okay, so here are the results from our initial study, and what this graph is showing you is how long infants looked at the unequal outcome and how long they looked at the equal outcome. These are averaged across the two types of movies infants saw for both the experimental and the control conditions. And what you can see is that infants showed a significantly longer looking times to the unequal outcome than the equal outcome, but this is only true of the experimental condition. In the control condition, they looked equally to both outcomes. So this suggested to us that 15-month-olds might be concerned with fairness here. They might be reacting on the basis of the fact that in one case, in the unequal outcome, this violates the socio-moral norm of fairness. Now, because we're very interested in converging measures, we also coded something else during this violation of expectancy paradigm. And so the additional thing that we coded is we coded what is called social referencing behavior. So for the uninitiated, social referencing behavior are instances in which infants and children will look to adults in unusual or unexpected situations. Typically, social referencing is looked at by doing something like bringing a parent and child into the lab, and there's some unusual, maybe unexpected, quasi-scary type of toy in the lab. And the child is presented with that, and the experimenter looks to see, what does the child do? Are they going to look to the experimenter and look to the parent as though to gather information about the situation? And one study had applied this kind of technique to a violation of expectancy paradigm, and they had found that in conditions where infants show enhanced attention to unexpected physical outcomes, like when one object seems like it's passing through another object, failing to obey the laws of physics, they also engage in more social referencing behavior on those types of trials. So we wanted to know if this would be true in our paradigm as well. So we coded infant social referencing behavior during the two types of outcomes, and of course here you have to control for the fact that infants just look longer at the unequal than the equal outcome. So these are rates of social looking as a function of the duration of infants' attention. And what you can see here is that infants show more social referencing looks to the unequal outcome than the equal outcome. So there's two pieces of evidence now that suggest that infants might be sensitive to these types of violations to fairness or equality norms. They look longer at unequal or unfair outcomes, and they show more social referencing behavior. Now, the next question we wanted to ask is whether this tendency might be related to what infants are doing on a sharing task, because we found group level effects, but of course in our sample, infants, unsurprisingly like adults, are individually variable in terms of how they perform. And we wanted to know if that individual variability was in any way meaningfully linked up with infants' prosocial behavior. So we came up with a novel sharing task that was really super simple, but I'm really kind of, I'm quite pleased with it because I think it has given us some very interesting results. So in the sharing task, what happens is that an infant is presented with two toys, the toys that you see here, a little green Lego block, a little doll. Intentionally, we've chosen one toy that could be seen as more attractive because we want to make sure that we elicit a preference from infants. So we place infants exactly in the center, we let them make a choice, and they pick one of the two toys. Most of the infants pick the doll, but regardless of which of the two toys they pick, we record their preferred toy as the toy that they chose. Then what happens is we give infants the other toy. So now the infant is holding both of the toys in their hands. And then we spin them around and they see someone who they've never seen before, a totally unfamiliar experimenter. The experimenter comes up to the infant and with outstretched hand says, "Can I have one?" and looks at the infant in the eyes. So that particular sequence was not accidental. First of all, we wanted to make sure that the experimenter wasn't inadvertently cueing the infant to one of the two toys. And second of all, we wanted to make sure that the request was ambiguous so that the infant could choose how they wanted to fulfill the request. So they could either give their preferred toy, their non-preferred toy, or no toy at all. And what we found in this sample is that about a third of the infants showed each of the patterns. About a third gave the preferred toy, a third gave the non-preferred toy, and a third chose not to share at all. So then the real question of interest here was how this might, or whether this performance on this task, might link up with what infants are doing in our violation of expectancy paradigm. And when we were attempting to relate performance on the two tasks, we focused solely on infants who shared one of the two toys, either more selfishly or more altruistically. The motivation for doing that is that when an infant shares a toy, fails to share a toy rather, One possibility is that they could be super selfish, right? They don't want to give either of the two toys to the experimenter. But another possibility is that infants could suffer from stranger anxiety, which is not unusual at this age, meaning they just kind of freeze up and shrink when they see a stranger. It could be that they're vacillating between the two options, right? And they don't know, or it could be that they're vacillating between the two options and they just don't know which one to choose. So we're focusing now on infants who either shared the preferred toy altruistically versus those who shared more selfishly. Yeah?
This is a very quick. Did you correct for dominant hand? Because if you have the toys on opposite sides.
Yeah, so we counterbalanced in terms of the locations of the toys, and we didn't find any effect of which hand the infant is dominant with or which hand they reach with. It didn't seem to make a difference. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Okay, so what this little table here is telling you is it's just dividing infants into two groups based on whether they shared the preferred or non-preferred toy, and it's saying which percentage of infants look longer to the unequal versus the equal outcome. So if we start with the top row, you can see that infants who shared the preferred toy, 75% of them showed the main experimental effect, meaning that they looked longer at the unfair or unequal outcome. Infants that shared the non-preferred toy almost showed the reverse pattern, with more of them looking longer at the equal outcome. And then another interesting thing that we coded is we looked to see whether if you just look at infants who share the preferred toy and you code how long it takes them to share the preferred toy. So the video clip that we saw first, that altruistic sharer who very rapidly handed it over, she was quick, but not all infants were that quick. We looked to see whether the latency to share the preferred toy was related to the extent of infants' preference for the unequal outcome, and we found a significant correlation, meaning babies who are really quickly sharing that preferred toy are showing the most heightened attention to the unequal outcome. Okay. This is just another way to show the relation. This is a raw looking time showing exactly the same thing, that infants who share the preferred toy tend to look longer at the unequal outcome. Okay, so now we have evidence for the fact that infants seem to have a sense of fairness when we're talking about their duration looking, their social referencing behavior. There's also individual variability. It links up to their prosocial behavior. The next question that we wanted to ask is we wanted to ask whether infants could use this information to guide who they wanted to affiliate with or who they wanted to play with. So after having seen a fair or an unfair distribution of goods, would they use that information to decide, hey, I want to play with the fair person over the unfair person? So we started by showing infants two displays. They're depicted here side by side, but they saw them one at a time. One person was consistently fair. The other person was consistently unfair. And what we did in this study, it was very tricky to arrange this, but I think worthwhile for the experimental control, is we arranged it so that they were sitting at a table and the distributor was doing actions below her waist. So what appeared to be happening to the infant and to you or I if we were watching the distribution play out is that she was putting toys on plates, she was putting the lids over the plates, and then she was distributing them to the recipients. In reality, what we did is we pre-prepared the plates so that the distributor had no idea whether she was distributing fairly or unfairly. So that's a nice experimental control, so now we know it's not the experimenter's knowledge of our own behavior that is driving the results. And then, of course, that's why they're looking down at the end to make sure that they don't learn of the outcome. So after seeing these distribution episodes, then what we did is we tested infants on a variety of different choice tasks, and all of the trials were a little bit different from one another, but the basic premise was they got to choose who to play with. The fair and the unfair actor were equidistant from the infant, and they were doing exactly the same thing, and we recorded who the infant chose to play with. So I'll show you what one of those trials looked like. Now I should say before showing you this video clip that I forget about this. As someone who works with infants in an experimental context all the time, I forget that it can look a little bit odd to outside observers. And the reason for that is that in our studies, our distributors, the actors, the fair and the unfair person, are trained and told that they have to be really careful about not reinforcing the infant. So the infant is going to make a choice on each trial, and of course our natural sort of tendency as adults interacting with cute infants would be to say, oh, yeah, thanks for coming to play with me. But of course that would ruin our experiment, because then what might happen is infants might pick on the basis of exuberance rather than on the basis of their prior behavior. So in this trial, what you're going to see is you're going to see a little infant who, for the first part of the trial, was watching the distributors play on the floor by themselves with blocks. This is Monica on the right here, on your right, and she is the fair actor. After watching for 20 seconds, the infant is put on the ground on a specific spot equidistant from the two distributors, and the parent is instructed to let the child go. And the parent doesn't know who is fair or unfair. So as you can imagine, it's very hard to be an experimenter in this line of work because you get all kinds of cute bids from children and you have to effectively ignore them. Okay, and so let's see here. These are the results. And so what this graph is showing us is it's just showing us across trials the proportion of the time the infant selected the fair over the unfair actor. And you can see that infants have a preference for the fair actor. 70% of the time they choose the fair actor at rates greater than chance. So what about our first question? Do infants have a sense of fairness? We think the answer is yes, certainly by 15 months of age based on the results of these two studies. And does it relate to their prosocial behavior? We think the answer is also yes. There's individual variability in infant sense of fairness, and it's related to how willing infants are to generously share toys. Okay, so the next question we wanted to ask is we wanted to know, is this the type of phenomena that undergoes developmental change, or is it continuous across development? If you were a nativist, you might say whenever you test, you're going to get the same effect because this is something that's built in. If you're someone who thinks socialization is important, you might have a different perspective. You might expect to see change. We tested a large group of infants at 6, 9, 12, and 15 months of age. We had infants participate, all of the infants participated in a very similar violation of expectancy paradigm. It had one little tweak that I'll tell you about in a moment, and I can tell you more about why in the question and answer session. And then the older infants in the sample got the sharing task that we developed in the lab, and I showed you initially where they could share their preferred or their non-preferred toy. 9-month-olds in our pilot work, we found that they were not sharing at all in the lab. They showed high rates of stranger anxiety. But in talking to parents, parents were saying that infants at this age were just beginning to share. If you ask parents, is your baby sharing with you? Are they giving you toys? Are they offering you toys? And about a third to half of the sample at 9 months would say, yes, they're just starting to share. And the remainder would say, no, not yet. So there's individual variability in terms of naturalistic settings when their infants at this age were sharing. And then the older infants, their parents completed some questionnaires that I'll tell you about in a moment, and we also did a follow-up visit, and I'll get back to that. So again, here's the violation of expectancy paradigm. This paradigm was a little different than the one I showed you in the first study because in this paradigm, infants saw simultaneous outcomes rather than sequential outcomes. And again, we timed their looking to those two outcomes. The prediction here is that they'll look longer at the unequal outcome if they have a sense of fairness. And we also tested infants on a control condition. We wanted to do a new and improved control condition. So in our first study, we showed infants just the physical outcomes. And we found that in that situation, infants are at chance, right? So it can't be a perceptual bias. But we thought, well, you know, we're rigorous experimentalists. What is another alternate interpretation? We thought, well, maybe it just has something to do with infants' expectations about how people put things into containers or how people sort things onto plates. And so to get around that critique, what we did is we ran a condition where it was exactly the same as the prior condition, but now pillows replace people, right? So there's still the same number of elements in the scene, but the person is acting towards inanimate objects. And so we shouldn't be concerned about fairness because they're not social beings. So I want to start by telling you the results from the 12 to 15-month-old infants. So replicating the first study, we found that infants look longer to the unequal outcome. This, because they're simultaneous here, we're presenting proportion looking to the unequal versus the equal outcome. So they look longer to the unequal outcome. So that's a replication of the first study, but the new finding here was that our 12-month-olds didn't look any different from our 15-month-olds. So we sort of traced it back to 12 months of age. And then, of course, in the interest of replication, we looked at how infants' performance on the violation of expectancy paradigm tied up with their performance on the lab sharing task and found the same pattern that we found in the first study. So babies who share the preferred toy look significantly longer at the unequal outcome. Babies who shared the non-preferred toy were at chance. Okay, so a replication of that relation. Now, one of the questions that we were most interested in was how infants' performance would vary as a function of age. And as you can see, we found that it did, in fact, vary as a function of age. With our 12 and 15-month-olds clearly showing the effect, our 9-month-olds were more variable. They were marginally above chance. And our 6-month-olds were at chance, suggesting that there's a developmental change going on here that seems to be happening at about 9 months of age. And because we knew from parental report, and because we thought that participation in sharing interactions might be really important for driving this change, since sharing interactions are kind of opportunity for stressing sharing, equality, reciprocity, principles that seem to be highly relevant to fairness. What we next wanted to know is, of our group of 9-month-olds, what if you take into account what parents are saying of their naturalistic sharing? And of course, parents were asked completely independently without knowing about their infant's performance. So here's what our results suggested. So we have 3 groups of infants here within our larger group of 9-month-olds. The ones on the far left are infants whose parents are saying, nope, never seen my infant share. They're not sharing with me. They're not sharing with anyone. Infants in the middle are ones who were sharing with the parent only, so doing selective sharing. And finally, infants on the far right-hand side are infants whose parents are saying they're not only sharing with me, but they also seem to be sharing with other people, with siblings, with friends that come into the home, et cetera, et cetera. So with respect to our second question, does infants' sense of fairness undergo developmental change, and what's the source of developmental change? Well, it appears to at about 9 months of age. It appears to be a transitional period in infant sense of fairness. And we don't know that participation in sharing interactions, of course, causes this developmental change based on the data that I've just showed you, because of course I'm showing you an association or correlation, but we know that they're tightly shared together, or tied together. Okay, so finally the individual differences question. So here we're trying to get at, okay, so these infants are individually variable from one another. What does that mean? Is this telling us something about infants who are really different from one another, or does this just have to do with kind of noise in our data? We thought it might have something to do with individual differences, and the reason we thought that is because it ties up very nicely with how infants share toys in the lab and at younger ages, infants' naturalistic sharing behavior. So there was reason to believe that it might tap individual differences. But we wanted to sort of get at that question a little bit more directly. So we took a sort of 2-pronged approach. The first thing that we did is the 12 and 15-month-olds that I just told you about, in addition to participating in our experimental measures, we gave their parents the Davis IRI, which is a measure that's commonly used to evaluate empathy, and it has a number of different subscales. And the perspective taking and empathic concern subscales are the most relevant. These are the ones that map onto some of the dimensions of empathy that Sarah talked about earlier, the cognitive dimensions and the emotional dimensions. Personal distress is kind of, you could say, almost the opposite of empathy. Fantasy should be unrelated. So parents of 12 to 15-month-olds completed the Davis IRI. The reason that we were interested in parental empathy is because, of course, we know from what Sarah just told us and from lots of literature that empathy is related to production of prosocial acts and just prosocial values in general. So our thought here was that if you have a parent who's higher in empathy, they're probably doing more prosocial types of things in general. They might also be doing things like more frequently stressing sharing interactions with their infant, be more concerned about getting across principles of equality and reciprocity. So we predicted that there would be a relation between parents' responses and infants' performance on our tasks. So this is just to give you a sense of some of the perspective-taking items, which are about appreciating everyone's side of a disagreement, trying to look at things from multiple perspectives, walking in other people's shoes. The empathic concerns are more the sort of affective components about having concerned feelings for people who are less fortunate than they are, feeling sorry for other people when they're having problems, etc., so on and so forth. So now what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you correlations between parent self-report, so parents reporting on their own empathy, and how infants performed on our violation of expectancy paradigm. And the dependent measure that we use with infants is a measure where we subtract how long they looked at the equal outcome from the unequal outcome as a sort of measure of the strength of their sense of fairness. So here's what we found. We found a significant relation between parental perspective-taking scores and infants' attention to the unequal outcome. We found a non-significant relation between empathic concern, but perhaps with a larger sample size it would be significant. And personal distress and fantasy were unrelated to what infants were doing in our experimental tasks. Now, at some level, you might think, well, this is completely intuitive, right? What you've just told us is that parents who are more empathic have kids who are more prosocial, in a sense, or care more about fairness. And at some level, that's not surprising. But I think what I find rather amazing about these results is the way that we've measured each of these things. So parents are being mailed questionnaires. They're sitting down at the kitchen table the night before they come into the lab, and they're filling out this questionnaire. And then they come into the lab, and we test babies on our task, and an independent observer who has no idea what the parent said in the questionnaire is making ratings of how long infants look at things. So I think it's pretty amazing that we're able to detect this relation, even though it might be somewhat intuitive. And finally, I want to say just a little bit about stability over time. So I mentioned that 12 and 15-month-olds returned at 21 and 24 months of age for a second visit. And here what we did is we tested infants on a battery of tasks where a fair and an unfair actor needed help in one way or another. And so the baby was forced to choose whether they were going to help or act prosocially towards the fair actor or towards the unfair actor. And then we looked to see, but this is what we've, the data has kind of just come in, so we haven't looked at all of the relative, irrelevant relations that we could look at, but we looked to see whether infants' sharing of the preferred versus the non-preferred toy at time 1 at 12 and 15 months of age predicted their interactions with the fair and unfair actors at 21 and 24 months of age, 9 months later. And what we found is that altruistic sharers were very selective in who they helped. They tended to help the fair actor over the unfair actor about 90% of the time. And infants who shared selfishly at the earlier time frame were close to chance. Only about 55% of the time they picked the fair actor. So I think there's some nice evidence for stability across time. So we think that individual variability might reflect individual differences because of the relations that we see with parental self-reported empathy. And also because we see that early generous sharing is predicting, in a sense, later endorsement of fair behavior by infants. So I just want to return to some of the main questions we asked. I told you about infants having a sense of fairness and whether this relates to their prosocial behavior. It's really tricky in these circumstances to tell whether infants react to these fairness violations in terms of them being a true moral transgression, or if they're thinking about it as something more like a violation of a social convention. So we're trying to come up with methods and techniques to tease apart those two interpretations. So this question about what is the source of developmental change, we're really interested in looking at the impact of sharing interactions. If sharing is kind of a causal factor in helping to develop a sense of fairness, you think you could intervene with slightly younger infants, encourage them to share, and perhaps influence their sense of fairness. And then finally, one of the things that we're really interested in doing is seeing if we can come up with interventions that impact parental empathy, maybe some of the interventions that Sarah used or some of the other interventions that are out there, and whether those might have some sort of not only effects on the parent in terms of increasing parental empathy, but downstream or trickle-down effects on their infants. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is super interesting. I was just wondering, this might be getting to the second and the third future direction question you just on the slide. I was wondering if you had any hypotheses or thoughts on the correlation between parental perspective taking and the sharing behavior of their children. Do you think this is something that they learn from their parents? Do you think they might be simply sharing certain genetic features with their parent and therefore exhibit similar kind of behavior, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously going to be some combination of both. But my thought is that what might happen is that parents who are higher in, so we are ultimately interested in looking at the link between actual parental behavior and what babies do. But of course, that's incredibly time-consuming and resource-intensive. So we thought, well, we'll start by just giving them kind of paper and pencil measures of characteristics you would think would be related to those types of behaviors, right? And so what we think is that parents who are higher in empathy, higher in perspective taking, higher in empathic concern, are probably doing things in life that stress prosocial values a lot more generally. But we also have a particular hypothesis about how they might approach certain interactions with their infants, particularly sharing interactions. So we think they might stress them more, like they might do them more frequently with their infants, and they might be more concerned about how they kind of play out structurally in terms of like promoting a structure where, okay, this toy is going to go back and forth and I'm not going to hog it the whole time and you're not going to hog it the whole time. So sort of using those opportunities, not necessarily consciously, but it maybe implicitly as kind of socialization vehicles for their infants. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about if you could walk through the reasoning of the VOE to the sense of fairness. So the behavior is looking longer at the unequal share, and then the looking longer is customarily taken to be something like surprise. Is that
Yeah, well, it's right. Okay, so it's. I think it is. It's a complex issue. So people use the word surprise, but they sometimes use it as shorthand. So they don't necessarily. Meaning we as a field, don't necessarily think that surprise entails the same sort of explicit, like you or I might experience surprise, right? In the sense that it's like, whoa, that was really surprising. I didn't expect that bird to fly through that window or something like that, right? That it could be much more implicit than that. And I think that that's probably what's going on in infants, is it's more of an implicit sense of fairness as opposed to an explicit, declarable thing that one could articulate.
Is this a thought that the surprise in this, let's call it, not effectively laden generic sense, right? And then the idea is that response you want to interpret as recognition of a norm violation, maybe, or something like that. Because what you don't want to call surprise, it still looks like it's a ways from something that you might think is super fancy, like a sense of fairness. Right. So I'm still not getting what the inferential.
Yeah. So I guess the logical, right? What's the inferential chain here, right?
Yes.
So I guess one could say, right, like it sort of depends on whether you buy each step in the chain. So adults, in contexts where they know very little about people, think that a fair solution to a problem is to divide resources equally. So that's one form of fairness. Of course.
Adults around here.
Yeah. Right. But also, but there's other kind of models of fairness, right? Like if you knew more about people and you knew that one person contributed more to something than another, then you might think a different solution is fair. So we're talking about a very restricted set of situations, right? When you're sort of operating under a veil of ignorance. So in that case, what we're then looking at is how infants respond when an equality norm is being violated, in a sense, right? So I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not as concerned about making the distinction between fairness and equality, right? Just that they, in some of the same circumstances that adults would say that that's unusual or unexpected, infants are doing that.
No, the piece I needed was that the hypothesis is the surprise, in scare quotes, is explained by an implicit sense of norm violation of a distribution norm.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And I think it's an open question, and this is sort of what I was trying to get at the end of my talk when I was talking about the distinction between social conventions and moral transgressions, is these types of paradigms can't really tell us whether infants also attach an evaluation to that. Right? And so that's what we're trying to get at now, looking at things like whether infants will selectively reward fair people and punish unfair people, for example, whether they'll associate more positively valent stimuli with fair people and more negatively valent stimuli with unfair people. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the moral conventional and how you're going to do that. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so we have, well, I would love to, so I'd love to hear people, I have 4 ideas, so I would love to hear people's feedback. Okay, so let me tell you, I'll tell you what mine are and then you tell me what yours are. So, so far the things that we've looked at is like the reward punishment thing, right? Because we wouldn't necessarily expect, if an infant saw someone get in the elevator and face the wrong way, right, which is the social convention violation, that they would want to punish that person, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that we're doing is, the problem with that, with younger infants, is that, that those require more complex types of procedures. So one of the things we're interested in seeing is if you, and have started doing, is if you show them these types of distributions, then you show them just the face of the fair or the unfair person. And then what you do is you play accompanying stimuli, and that stimuli is either positive or negative. So if infants are kind of positively evaluating one, negatively evaluating the other, they should systematically vary their attention as a function of the accompanying stimulus. Yeah, that's another way. Another thing that we've thought of is to look to see whether, whether infants are making inferences about other behaviors folks might engage in once they've done the fair versus unfair thing. So here, let me tell you a paradigm that we recently have been working with and have come up with. It's called the stolen toy paradigm. So what happens in this paradigm is babies see the unfair and fair distributions. Then what they see is they see the fair and unfair distributor sitting at a table. There's an attractive toy in the middle. The experimenter puts the attractive toy down, and then she starts to walk away. As she starts to walk away, both of them simultaneously reach for the toy. Then she says to them, "Don't touch my toy. I'm going to leave the room, but when I come back, my toy had better be here." Then she leaves the room. The baby's turned around, the toy disappears, the experimenter comes back, both of the distributors are kind of look like they're playing with something under the table. And the experimenter says, "Where's my toy? Who took my toy? Did you take my toy? Did you take my toy?" And then the infant is asked, "Johnny, who took my toy?" So are they going to infer on the basis of the person being previously unfair that they're a more likely candidate to have stolen the toy than acting fairly? So those are some of the ideas we have, yeah. Did you have, but I would love to hear yours as well.
Yeah, I don't think we have time.
Okay, well, maybe later, because I'd love to hear about them, yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks.